It's been 4 days since Alex started the night shift at the lighthouse. The isolation didn't bother him. In fact, he relished it, except for one thing. It was the radio. Every night at precisely 2:13 a.m., it would crackle to life with a burst of static. On his first night, Alex dismissed it as interference, but the consistency of the timing soon unsettled him. He reported it to his supervisor, who promised to send a technician but offered no other explanation. Still feeling safe in the light of day, Alex decided to research the history of the lighthouse. He discovered that in 1755, the lighthouse keeper at the time, Henry Winstanley, had disappeared without a trace during a violent storm. The official report suggested he had been swept out to sea, but his body was never found. Alex stared out at the waters, which was beginning to turn a deep blue as the sun began to set. As the night wore on, Alex's unease grew. He started noticing small things out of place. A chair that had seemed to move, a book left open when he was sure he'd closed it. He tried to rationalize it, blaming his own forgetfulness or the wind, but a nagging doubt persisted. Then the weather took a turn for the worse, and right when the gale seemed to reach its peak, Alex heard a pounding on the door at the base of the tower. Heart racing, he descended the spiral staircase, convinced someone was seeking refuge from the storm. But when he opened the door, he found only the howling wind and lashing rain. As he was about to close it, a flash of lightning illuminated a figure standing on the rocks below. For a split second, Alex saw a man in old-fashioned keeper's clothes, his face obscured by the driving rain. Shaken, Alex retreated to the top of the tower. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, he knew what he had seen was real. The next day, Alex reported the incident to the Coast Guard. They searched the area but found no sign of anyone having been there. They suggested that the isolation might be getting to him and recommended he take some leave. But Alex had only just started here. He was determined to get to the bottom of what was happening. He set up cameras around the lighthouse, hoping to catch evidence of an intruder. Night after night, he reviewed the footage, but found nothing out of the ordinary, and he never saw the figure again. As his shift neared its end, Alex's nerves were frayed. The radio continued its nightly static, a voice occasionally breaking through, always just on the edge of comprehension. He found himself jumping at shadows, convinced he was being watched. On his final night, a storm of unprecedented fury descended upon the lighthouse. The wind howled like a living thing, and waves crashed against the tower with such force that Alex feared it might collapse. At 2:13 a.m., the radio crackled to life. This time, the voice came through clearly, urgently repeating a single phrase: "The light must not go out." Suddenly, the power failed. The lighthouse was plunged into darkness, its vital beam extinguished. Alex fumbled for the emergency generator switch, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached for it, he felt a cold hand brush against his own. The generator roared to life, the beam cutting through the darkness once more. Alex spun around, but he was alone in the lantern room. Yet he could have sworn he heard a sigh of relief that wasn't his own. As dawn broke, the storm subsided. Alex stood at the top of the tower, watching the sun rise over a calm sea. He had no explanation for what had happened during the night. Part of him wanted to dismiss it all as stress and an overactive imagination. But as he prepared to leave the lighthouse, handing over to the day shift keeper, Alex found himself hesitating. He felt a strange reluctance to leave, as if his duty here wasn't quite finished. He looked back at the tower one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the top, watching him, but when he blinked, it was gone. Alex walked away, his mind filled with questions. He knew he would be back for another shift, drawn by a mystery he couldn't explain and a duty he didn't fully understand. The lighthouse stood silent behind him, its secret still untold, waiting for the next lonely night watch. The following events took place at the Cartwright Hotel in 1983, as documented in both police reports and the written statement of James Morton, the night porter who resigned shortly after the incident. The Cartwright had stood on Marion Street since 1926, its red brick facade darkened by decades of city grime. By '83, it was well past its prime, surviving mainly on business travelers trying to save a buck and the occasional tourist who didn't know any better. The carpet was worn thin, the wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the ancient radiators clanked and sputtered through the winter nights. James Morton had worked the night shift for 8 months without incident. At 47, he was overqualified for the position, but after his divorce, he needed something, anything, to keep him occupied during the sleepless hours. Most nights passed uneventfully, checking in late arrivals, responding to the occasional complaint about noisy pipes, and making his hourly rounds through the empty corridors. On February 15th, the hotel was nearly empty. A midweek snowstorm had caused multiple cancellations, leaving only 6 occupied rooms out of 68. Morton settled in for another quiet night, armed with his paperback and lukewarm coffee from the break room urn. At 1:17 a.m., he heard the first noise. A distinct scraping sound from the second floor, like furniture being dragged across hardwood beneath the carpet. Morton checked the guest registry. Room 212 was occupied by a businessman from Toledo, but 212 was on the opposite end from where the sound had originated. Following protocol, he made his way upstairs to investigate. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he walked the length of the hall. Nothing seemed out of place. All doors were closed, no signs of disturbance. He was about to chalk it up to the building's usual settling when he noticed something odd. The runner carpet at the far end of the hall was slightly askew, as if it had been pushed sideways a few inches. Morton straightened the carpet and continued his rounds. By 2:45 a.m., he had almost forgotten about the incident when the phone at the front desk rang. Room 212. The businessman was reporting strange noises, like someone moving furniture in the room above him. But room 312 was unoccupied. Again, Morton climbed the stairs to investigate. The third floor corridor was darker. 2 of the fluorescent tubes had burned out months ago, creating pools of shadow between the sickly circles of light. He had complained to maintenance about it twice, but they never seemed to get around to replacing them. As he approached room 312, the temperature dropped noticeably. February in New England. The old heating system struggled to maintain warmth in the unoccupied areas. That's all it was. But when he reached for his master key, he froze. Through the door, he could hear something, a slow, rhythmic creak, like someone rocking in a chair. Morton's hand shook slightly as he inserted the key. The lock clicked, and he pushed the door open. The room was empty, of course. No furniture had been moved. The ancient rocking chair that was supposed to be in the corner was still covered in its dust sheet, perfectly still. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. On the worn carpet, barely visible in the dim light from the hall, fresh indentations in a curved pattern, as if the chair had been rocking moments before. He backed out of the room quickly, locking the door. As he walked away, he could have sworn he heard the creaking resume. Morton submitted his resignation the following week. In his written statement, he described 2 more incidents that occurred that night. The sound of footsteps following him on his 4 a.m. rounds, always staying just around the corner, and the distinct smell of lavender perfume wafting from vacant rooms. He never returned to the hotel, even to collect his final paycheck. The Cartwright Hotel was demolished in 1997 to make way for an office building. During the demolition, workers discovered an old maintenance tunnel in the walls, long sealed off, with peculiar scratch marks on the inside of the access panel. The marks were never officially explained. Today, employees at the office building occasionally report strange sounds after hours, like furniture being moved in empty rooms, or the slow creak of a rocking chair. But that, of course, is a different story. Hannah had always been a night owl, so when she landed the night shift job at Oakwood, she thought it would be perfect. The pay was good and the quiet halls suited her introverted self. But on her 3rd week, something changed. One night, while making her rounds on the 3rd floor, Hannah saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform was standing at the end of the corridor. The uniform was pristine white, a stark contrast to the dimly lit hallway. But what truly terrified Hannah was the figure's face, or rather the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only a blank, featureless expanse of skin. Hannah blinked, and the figure was gone. She convinced herself it was just a trick of the light, a result of too many consecutive night shifts. But deep down, she knew what she had seen was real. As the weeks passed, strange occurrences became more frequent. Medical equipment would move on its own. Doors would slam shut without warning. And always, there were the whispers. Hannah confided in her colleague, Corey, who had been working the night shift for years. To her surprise, he didn't dismiss her fears. Instead, he told her a story that chilled her to the bone. Back in the 1950s, Corey said, his voice low, there was a nurse here named Elizabeth Marsh. She was dedicated to her patients, often working double shifts to ensure they received the best care. But one night, something went wrong. Corey paused, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. There was a patient, a man with a history of violence. Elizabeth was checking on him when he suddenly attacked her. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Elizabeth died right here in this hospital. Hannah felt a chill run down her spine. And you think she's still here? Corey shrugged. All I know is that strange things have been happening here for years, and they always seem to intensify around the anniversary of Elizabeth's death. Hannah checked the date on her phone. The anniversary was tomorrow night. As her shift began the following evening, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. The whispers seemed louder, more urgent. The shadows in the corners of her eyes danced and shifted, always just out of sight when she turned to look. Around midnight, Hannah was called to the third floor to assist with a patient. As she stepped off the elevator, the lights flickered ominously. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was charged with an otherworldly energy. She rounded the corner and froze. There, at the end of the hallway, stood the faceless nurse. This time, it didn't disappear when Hannah blinked. Instead, it began to move towards her, its steps eerily silent on the linoleum floor. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. As the figure drew closer, she could make out more details. The uniform was stained with what looked horribly like dried blood. And though the nurse had no face, Hannah could feel its gaze boring into her. Just as the figure was about to reach her, Hannah heard a noise behind her. She turned to see Corey running down the hallway, his face pale with fear. "Hannah, we have to get out!" he yelled. Hannah looked back, but the nurse was gone. Instead, the lights around them began to flicker ominously. And then, one right above their heads shattered and went out. As if heeding the warning, Corey grabbed Hannah's arm and pulled her toward the stairwell. Now, more light bulbs exploded as they ran, showering the hallway with sparks and bits of broken glass. The shadows seemed to chase them, closing in around them as the lights went out one by one. They burst through the stairwell door, taking the steps two at a time. Hannah didn't dare look back and tried to shut out the horrific mental image of the faceless nurse bounding after them in the growing darkness. Just as they reached the ground floor, the door above them slammed open with a thunderous crash. Hannah and Corey ran out into the parking lot, gasping for breath. They turned to look back at the hospital, its windows dark except for a single light on the third floor. As they watched, the light began to flicker rapidly before going out completely. The night was suddenly unnaturally quiet. No whispers, no screams, just the sound of their own ragged breathing. Hannah turned to Corey, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. What just happened?" she asked. Corey shook his head, his face grim. "I don't know, but I don't think it's over." As if in response to his words, a single light flickered back to life on the third floor. And in the window, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure in a nurse's uniform, watching them.